Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Anderson, and I am the Industry Operations Manager here at the National Apartment Association. Today's exciting webinar is Managing Mold, an overview of NAA's newly revised Mold Action Toolkit. Before we would begin, I would like to ask that everyone please mute your line to ensure no background noise is disruptive to today's presentation. This webinar will be recorded and available to all members located on our website's resource library. In addition, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. You may submit a question in the chat box under the Q&A tab to participate. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sherry Solomon, President of Clean Health Environmental LLC. Clean Health provides comprehensive industrial hygiene, infection control, and OSHA training services, offering valuable risk management and compliance solutions. Sherry possesses more than 19 years of environmental consulting and federal regulatory experience. An attorney by trade, combined with her experience in the industrial hygiene field, Sherry holds a unique expertise in understanding of liability prevention techniques. Sherry, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it and this great opportunity to speak with you today. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to share a little with everyone about my background, I am an attorney by trade, as Stephanie mentioned, and I focused on regulatory environmental law during law school and started my career in 1999 with the National Apartment Association National Multi-Housing Council. And so I was the original author of this Mold Action Kit back in 2001 when it was first published. And with that, I then joined the industrial hygiene field and have been practicing as an industrial hygienist for the past 15 years. And it's a great honor to have an opportunity to revisit this publication that I created 20 years ago and share it with you today. So let's go ahead and start with an overview of what we're going to be reviewing today. In this webinar, we're going to discuss the toolkit to include a compilation of resources from the National Apartment Association. We have updated our different resources in light of the changes in the industry in the past 20 years. In addition, we're going to discuss best practices to assist with managing mold in the apartment community. And then we'll also cover how mold is impacting the multifamily industry today and provide an overview on the state of the industry. So just to give a broad understanding of where we were in the industry in 2001 and how far we have come. As I shared with you, when I was working for the apartment industry, back in 2001, there was a lot of concern surrounding mold, and it was really a new issue that was impacting the apartment industry. There were a lot of issues with related lawsuits and a number of personal injury attorneys that were literally knocking on people's doors, on renters' doors, asking them if they wanted to sue their landlords for mold. And there was a lot of misinformation and hysteria about the actual effects, health effects of mold in the indoor environment. In addition, back in 2001, there was just the announcement from the insurance industries that there were going to be exclusions related to mold coverage. And so that was having a huge impact on the apartment owners and managers as well as the renters. Since 2001, a lot has changed. There have been a number of industry standards and guidance documents that have been published, as well as a slew of research regarding potential health effects. And that really has shifted the industry. We still have mold issues that we need to address. We still need to manage mold on our apartment properties. But as far as the recognition of the potential health effects and liability prevention, things have definitely shifted. So first, I want to just review what is included in the Mold Action Kit and do a brief overview, and then we will delve into some of the more significant portions and changes as we go through the hour session. Of course, we need to get the disclaimer out of the way, so there you go. And now we're going to go ahead and review the table of contents and what is highlighted in the Mold Action Kit. In Table 1, you will find, in Tab 1, you will find the 10 things you should know about mold. And this is a list that was provided by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a really nice overview of the different components and the different facts related to mold exposure and mold in apartment communities. And in general, it's recognized that there's no practical way to eliminate all mold and mold spores in the indoor environment. The way to control indoor mold is to control the moisture, and that's really the key. The top 10 things also reference that mold can be found almost anywhere. As we know, mold is an essential part of our environment. It makes up 25% of the Earth's biomass, and it is a key component of our environment. For all of those reasons, we need to recognize that mold itself is not problematic, but mold, when it is growing in the indoor environment, is problematic. In regards to Tab 2, the National Apartment Association, National Multi-Housing Council Operation and Maintenance Plan. In Tab 2, you will find significant detail in regards to how best to operate and maintain your property. There is a document that we will go over in much more detail when we get to the later sections, but this document covers training, it covers routine maintenance, remediation techniques, recommended documentation, and sample communication plans to educate residents about mold. And we will be highlighting this section in more detail when we get to the liability management section. And as we will discuss in detail, it's important to recognize that this document, this operation and maintenance plan, has steadily over the past 20 years become the industry standard of care. And when we're talking about liability management, we want to make sure we are addressing the operation and maintenance of our properties. So we'll be discussing this in more detail when we get to the liability section. Tab number 3 is the Mold Remediation in Schools and Commercial Buildings document. And this is one of our key guidance documents that we've used in the industry since 2001. So when this was first published back in 2001, there were a number of different property management companies that were focused on this document. And it was updated in 2008. And in 2008, it really didn't have many significant changes, just some brief minor changes. So it really is a similar document than it was in 2008. And in 2008, when it was republished, it highlighted the fact that the recommendation of not using biocides when we're dealing with a mold remediation and using a proper detergent solution. But the basic concepts have remained the same, and that is determining what level of mold it is based on the visible square footage of the mold growth. And I think that's one of the most important concepts when we're discussing mold mitigation in apartment properties, is recognizing that it's not about the amount of mold in the air, but it's about the amount of visible mold growth when we're dealing with apartment properties. So if it's under 10 square feet of visible mold growth, it's considered a small level remediation, which could be conducted in-house typically. And if it's between 10 and 100 square feet of visible mold growth, it's considered a medium level remediation. And over 100 square feet, it's considered a large level remediation. And based on that, we determine what proper personal protective equipment to use, what proper containment to use, and appropriate cleanup methods. That is our primary industry document that we use as far as assessment and remediation of mold in apartment properties. Tab number 4, a brief guide to mold, moisture, and your home, is a very valuable document, and it really is intended for renters and for homeowners to understand how to clean up residential mold problems and how to prevent mold growth. So this is a printable version. It's a pamphlet, and it may be something that is considered for distribution to your residents. When I was with the National Apartment Association, National Multi-Housing Council, back in 1999 to 2002, this was one of the documents we were really pushing Environmental Protection Agency to publish, and they did so initially in 2002, updated it in 2012, and again, the primary intention was for it to be a resource to our residents so they can best understand how to prevent and mitigate mold issues. Tab number 5 we included is from the California Department of Public Health, and it is another resource for your renters and for the residents. And again, it's about a 7-page document, and it goes through how to mitigate mold issues, how to identify them, how to address them, and how they can play a role in mold mitigation as residents in that property. Tab number 6 is the resource guide in regards to our industry standards and reference documents. And we're going to go ahead and take a little time to review these documents in more detail. We'll go through and highlight some of the more recent guidance document standards that have been published since first publishing the Mold Action Kit in 2001. In addition, in tab 6, there is a number of the health-related reports that I made mention of. In particular, the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have both issued notable reports regarding their findings on health effects concerning exposures as a result of damp indoor environments and microbial growth. And we will also visit that in more detail as we go throughout this presentation. In tab number 7, we get into the Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards. And we all recognize that during a mold remediation or a mold inspection, workers are going to face potential hazards on the job site. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, their sole focus is the employer-employee relationship and ensuring that the employer is best protecting the employee. And so there are a number of OSHA regulations that may come into play during a mold remediation, but may not be particular to mold assessment and mold remediation itself. For example, respiratory protection, personal protective equipment, hazard communication. So tab 7 goes through the different OSHA regulations that may come into play during a mold remediation and provide proper procedures for compliance with those regulations. OSHA did issue a number of guidance documents versus a standard or regulation as it relates to mold. And in tab 7, there is a reference to the brief guide to mold in the workplace. And again, that is a guideline providing recommendations for prevention of mold growth and describes measures designed to protect the health of building occupants and workers involved in mold remediation and prevention. OSHA also published another guidance document titled Preventing Mold-Related Problems in Indoor Workplace in 2006, and that was published in order to focus on prevention of mold growth in the indoor environment. And both of these documents are valuable, ensuring that your workers are protected when they are doing a mold assessment, mold remediation of your apartment property. Tab 10 is our resource guide, and that identifies different industry certifications and training providers. There's a handful of professional industry organizations that provided mold assessment and mold remediation services. Typically, they're geared towards the professionals responsible that you might hire and outsource for this type of project, but this is not an exhaustive list, and there may be local providers that could be of assistance as well. In tab 11, we review the state of litigation, and I will highlight some of the more interesting and more recent cases in our liability section at the end of this presentation. Tab 12 are state licensing requirements for mold professionals. That's another change that's occurred in the industry over the past 20 years. We have a number of states, a handful of states and jurisdictions that are requiring licensing for those professionals conducting mold assessment and mold remediation, and we'll briefly review those. Tab 13, our overview of our applicable state indoor air quality laws and building codes. Tab 14 is our best practices for reducing moisture intrusion and excessive mold growth during construction and renovation. And this was a document published by the National Apartment Association, National Multi-Housing Council. And what this document does is offers a baseline best practice to address moisture intrusion issues and excessive mold growth during the design and construction of low-rise wood-framed construction. So while it's impossible to make a building mold-proof, building owners and design and construction professionals can minimize the risk of mold growth through proper planning and the use of appropriate building materials and construction techniques. So this white paper, is meant to highlight and optimize conditions in the built environment that will discourage dampness and ultimately limit the growth of mold. And then finally, in tab 15, you'll find the National Apartment Association Mold Lease Addendum, and we will be going over that in more detail when we get to the liability section as well. So to delve into some of the key components of the revised Mold Action Kit, as I mentioned, there are a number of recently published guidance and reference documents, brief review of the scientific literature surrounding health effects, and the emergence of state laws, as I just mentioned. To give you a highlight of what we found in our tabs, the Mold Remediation Schools and Commercial Buildings document, as I've mentioned, is one of our key documents. I am here in the Silver Spring, Maryland area, in the DC area, and the Mold Remediation Schools and Commercial Buildings is also the guidance document that has been utilized to create licensing in the District of Columbia. So it really is recognized as an industry standard of care and something we should be adhering to. Another guidance and reference document that is used regularly in apartment properties is the New York City Department of Health Guidelines on Assessment and Remediation of Fungi in Indoor Environments. That was first published in 1999, and then it was updated in 2008. And while it is a New York City Department of Health guideline, it was the first industry guideline that addressed mold assessment and mold remediation, and therefore, regardless of the fact that it's just from New York City, it is recognized as a national guideline and part of our industry standard of care. Next set of guidance documents that is also included in the Mold Action Kit, our IRCRC Standard and Reference Guide for Professional Water Damage Restoration, which was revised in 2015, and our IRCRC S520 Standard for Professional Mold Remediation, which was last revised in 2015. And again, both of these documents represent industry standard of care, the IRC S500, of course, focusing on water damage. If we can identify and address the water damage before we get to dealing with the mold remediation, that would always be ideal. Another document that I find very valuable from the mold assessment side of the industry is the Bradley Prazen American Industrial Hygiene Association Recognition, Evaluation, and Control of Indoor Mold. So the primary documents that we just looked at the last two slides were more so focused on the remediation efforts, This document is more so for those folks that are doing the assessment, the inspection, to identify the growth, to identify where the source may be coming from, which is always the first step of any mold remediation, and to assist with the process of assessment and evaluation. So very valuable document and one that I use in the field on a regular basis. The second highlighted section I wanted to talk about is the science. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there has been a lot of challenges in regards to identifying the potential science-related challenges. There was a lot of hysteria back in the day in regards to mold assessment and mold remediation, and we did not really have the science to back up where we were identifying the health effects. And so when we were looking for some additional information, we identified damp indoor spaces and health. And that was a publication that was published by the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine, and the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine published a report in 2004. And this really changed the state of the industry because there was a lot of concerns related to potential health effects. And when the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine published this report, it significantly changed the industry. And first, what the National Academy of Science said is we don't want to just look at mold in the indoor environment, because when we are in a damp environment, there are a number of pests that proliferate: dust mites, bacteria, volatile organic compounds. They all like damp spaces. So let's look at damp spaces in general. And when we looked at damp spaces in general, what the National Academy of Science found is that there's sufficient evidence that damp indoor spaces can cause allergies and it can cause exacerbation of asthmatic conditions. What it did not find was that it can cause more, it did find limited evidence that damp indoor environments can cause asthma development or shortness of breath or lower respiratory illness in otherwise healthy children. And what they found inadequate or insufficient evidence for both damp indoor environments and mold were all the things listed here. And so this really had a direct impact on the industry and ensuring that when there is a legal case, that this has been an ongoing referenced research and validation that mold is understood to cause allergies and exacerbation in the indoor environment, but there is limited evidence that it causes anything other than that in an indoor environment in otherwise healthy individuals. Also wanted to address the issue and the terminology of toxic effects and the terminology people use calling it toxic mold. According to the National Academy of Science, according to the IICRC, the term toxic mold is really a misnomer. It is really the appropriate terminology is toxigenic mold that has the capability of producing toxins, but does it have the does it cause toxigenic impacts, toxic impacts in a human? And that's where the science has been limited. So it is that there is the capability during certain parts of a lifespan of a mold spore to produce mycotoxins, but not to a level that is going to create toxic effects in a human body. And therefore, the terminology toxic mold is really inappropriate. So I want to highlight some of the jurisdictions that are now requiring professional licensure. As you see here, there's 5 states currently, and that's highlighted in our handout as far as what is required for professional licensure. So depending on each jurisdiction, there's going to be different requirements, but in general, the District of Columbia, Florida, Louisiana, New York, and Texas are requiring different licensing requirements for those professionals. So for example, in District of Columbia, if you are in landlord-tenant housing and you identify more than more than 10 square feet of mold, you must hire a licensed professional. You must hire a licensed mold assessment professional to do the assessment to identify and validate there is visible growth and it is affecting more than 10 square feet in an affected area. And then you must hire a third-party mold remediator to conduct the remediation. You must then bring back the licensed mold assessor to do the mold assessment validation at the end of the project. Similarly, in Florida, there are also requirements for mold assessors and mold remediators to be licensed. In Louisiana, there are requirements that only the mold remediator be licensed. In New York, the mold assessor and mold remediator must be licensed to do any mold assessment or mold remediation in New York, and in Texas as well. Both mold assessors and mold remediators, as well as training providers and laboratories, must be licensed. So that's really how the industry has shifted in recognizing that if we are going to hire professionals to conduct mold assessment and to conduct mold remediation, they should be properly licensed and trained to do so. Moving on now to our liability prevention section and highlighting some of the examples. As I mentioned, most definitely the industry has changed when it comes to mold and litigation. Back in the day, like I mentioned earlier, there were a number of personal injury attorneys that were very focused on this issue. And what was happening really back then were they were dealing with small type of settlements. So they would potentially knock on a resident's door and suggest and ask if there's mold in their apartment. And what they would do was send letters, maybe for $10,000, $12,000, $15,000, asking for that residence to be removed from their lease and to be recouped costs for the alleged mold in their indoor environment. And with that, a lot of the apartment communities at the time were settling because for $10,000 or $12,000, it just wasn't worth it to go through with the lawsuit and the litigation. So it was very savvy of the personal injury attorneys, and they recognized that they would make a little money, the resident would make a little money, they would be out of their lease, and then there would be less challenges as far as additional litigation. But those litigations, those settlements, 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, really started adding up significantly, and there was having a direct impact on the apartment communities and on apartment budgets. And so with that, as I mentioned earlier, and the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine study that was published, we identified that a lot of those lawsuits were not going through and not as successful due to those limitations, because a savvy defense attorney, if they're alleging that mold caused some of these more serious ailments, would hold up the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine report and dispute that. So it did substantially change the state of litigation when it comes to mold in apartment communities. But that being said, we all know that there are still threats of lawsuits, there are still potential for lawsuits, and we still have to be sure that we are best protecting ourselves. And I'm going to go through a couple of the examples of litigation. I think something that is important and consistent throughout all of these legal lawsuits is related to responsiveness. And as you'll see as I go through them, it tends to be that the lawsuits that are that the plaintiffs are successful, that the residents are successful, are around improper response from property management companies. As I always say to my clients, it's not that your industry standard of care is that water will never get into your buildings. We all need water. We all use water. It is essential. Water will get into our buildings. There will be leaks. But the key to industry standard of care is how do we respond to those leaks? Are we properly identifying the challenges? Are we responding quickly within 24 to 48 hours? Are we documenting that we've addressed the issue? It's really about responding, documenting, and following up with the residents to ensure that the issue has been addressed, whether it's a water damage issue or whether it's a mold issue. So looking at some of the examples of litigation, the first one would be McCartney versus PA Lex Glenn. McCartney sued the management company for negligence based on personal injuries that he alleged, and the trial court granted summary judgment in favor of the defendant, finding the plaintiff had insufficient evidence for causation. And so what we recognize is that the primary cause of action that a resident is going to bring against a property owner, property manager, is negligence. Were you negligent in how you managed your property? Did you act as a reasonable professional should have acted in your circumstance? And if you breached that duty and that industry standard and caused an injury, then you are negligent. So that's a 4-pronged test: duty, breach, causation, injury. And so negligence is one of the more common causes of action that a resident will bring against a property management company. The second obvious cause of action would be breach of contract. We had a contract to provide a habitable condition, and you failed to provide that habitable condition by allowing mold to grow, and you violated that contract. You breached the contract. So those are the primary 2 causes of action. On that note, a second case we want to talk about is the Beverly Allen versus Breckenridge Partners here in Montgomery County, Maryland. According to the tenant, the landlord failed to respond when they complained about high levels of mold in the apartment, causing illness to the tenant's family, damaging personal property, and forcing the tenant to break their lease. They sued the landlord over breach of contract, that the landlord failed to maintain the property in a reasonable, safe condition. And the jury found the landlord liable and awarded the tenant $19,400. And the appeals court ruled that the tenant is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees as well, which we all recognize can be substantial. In the Cohen versus Fox case, an Oregon jury returned a verdict of $103,000 plus attorney's fees against the property management. And again, they complained of water leaks. Despite the complaint, no repairs were made. Again, it comes back to lack of responsiveness from the property management company. So I think that highlights the most of the cases. To just finish up with the mold in military housing, we're reading the news, we see that there's ongoing challenges with mold growth in military housing. In this specific case in Virginia in 2016, the attorneys for the plaintiffs made claims for both breach of contract and negligence per se, and the jury found the plaintiffs were negligent, but they rejected their contract-based cause of action as far as the breach of contract. So they were successful in the negligence claim, not successful in the cause of action, but that family was awarded $350,000. So these claims can be substantial, and we want to do our best to minimize our opportunity and minimize even the threat of a lawsuit. So how do we best do that? How do we best minimize the threat of a lawsuit? One is adherence to the industry standard of care. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, is recognizing that we all as an industry have an industry standard of care that we need to follow. We need to act as the prudent professional in our industry should be doing, whether we're talking to a resident on the phone or we're collecting the money for the rent, or we are dealing with a indoor air quality issue. We are held to the reasonable professional standard. We act like a reasonable professional, and if we fail to do that and we cause an injury. So how do we adhere to our industry standard of care, and what is our industry standard of care? Well, that's exactly where the Mold Action Kit comes in. This Mold Action Kit is a number of resources to assist us in identifying and adhering to our industry standard of care. and one in particular is the National Apartment Association Operation and Maintenance Plan, which is tab 2 of the Mold Action Kit. And we put this O&M program together back in 2002, and it has been slightly updated, but it really has not changed. The basic concepts and the basic understanding of how we operate and maintain a building to minimize the opportunity for mold growth really has not changed in the industry. The key to all of this is preventive maintenance. We prevent the opportunity for the water intrusion, and we prevent the mold growth. So a number of the resources that you have in the Mold Action Kit really focus on prevention. Prevention not only from the property management and the maintenance team doing preventive maintenance checks, doing your preventive maintenance procedures, documenting those, but also as far as residents and understanding their roles and their responsibilities in being part of the solution, how they maintain their units, and their responsibilities for notifying the property management company, for example, if they do find an issue. So it's about preventive maintenance from the property management perspective, in addition to resident education and understanding what their responsibilities are in all of this. In addition, under the Operation and Maintenance Plan are components of staff training, a very key component of it, recognizing if there are challenges, and if there are challenges, recognizing how to properly ensure that they are best protecting the residents and the property. So staff training, documenting staff training, all a key component of the National Apartment Association Operation and Maintenance Plan. Documentation, documentation, documentation. Key in the Operation and Maintenance Plan, there are a number of different checklists. There are different resources. There's a resident follow-up letter to validate that you've addressed the issue, you've notified the resident, and that they can come to you if there are any additional issues. So that's really important in sort of closing out that project, ensuring that it has been addressed to meet the needs of that resident can be very valuable. And in addition, the O&M program reviews proper remediation procedures. If you do identify visible suspect fungal growth, how do you best address it? As I mentioned earlier, the first step of any mold remediation, fix the source of the moisture problem. The first step of any mold remediation, fix the source of the moisture problem. A lot of times we or our residents are so focused on the mold growth, but the key and the focus needs to be on addressing the source of the issue first. If we don't address the source, we are going to then spend money on remediating it, and the mold is going to come back. So first we assess, we identify the source, we address the source, and then we conduct the remediation. And in regards to the proper remediation procedures, those are also clearly delineated in the Operation and Maintenance Plan. And in short, it comes down to where the mold is growing. If the mold is growing on a porous building material or content, such as drywall, such as furnishings, then it will be removed and replaced. If mold is growing on semi-porous or non-porous, like wood, or non-porous meaning metal, glass, or plastic, it should be removed with a detergent solution. The mold cannot feed on glass, metal, or plastic, and so it should be easily removed. If it's a semi-porous building material, as I mentioned, such as wood, typically wood can be cleaned with a detergent solution so long as the mold growth is removed, and you can continue to use that building component. So that really is a very shortened version of what a remediation procedure looks like, but in the O&M program, it provides a lot more detail and step-by-step remediation procedures. The key to the O&M program is resident follow-up and documentation and communication. Like I mentioned, the number of the lawsuits surrounding mold in apartment properties is related to lack of proper response. And if we can respond and document and communicate appropriately, we will all be better off, and our liability will be better managed. The next portion of the liability management is the mold addendum, and that is tab 15 of the Mold Action Kit. In the mold addendum, which is a very valuable document and highly recommended, there's a number of sections. And like I said earlier, it's really about understanding that we all play a role in this. Apartment property managers and the residents play a shared responsibility in addressing mold issues. In general, the property management company, the property owner, is responsible for the building and the building systems, the mechanical system, the plumbing system, the building envelope, and the residents responsible for resident behavior and how they maintain their unit in regards to proper sanitation, ensuring that they're running their HVAC system appropriately, ensuring that they're notifying property management if there are any visible growth or any sort of related issues, recognizing that bleach, biocides are not necessary nor recommended during a mold remediation, but in fact, a detergent solution is all you need. So looking at the mold addendum, it goes into recognizing what the renter should be adhering to. And of course, this is of value for two reasons. One, upon lease signing, they recognize that they have a responsibility in addressing and notifying you if there's any mold issues and how they maintain their unit. And also it's a liability protection that if they fail to do so, there is some protection there. So as it states in the, on the addendum, if you fail to comply with this addendum, you can be held responsible for property damage to the dwelling and any health problems that may result. We can't fix problems in your dwelling unless we know about them. On that note, it goes through in the mold addendum to keep the dwelling clean, to remove visible moisture accumulation on windows, walls, ceilings, and other areas as reasonably possible, to promptly notify property management if there's any air conditioning or heating system issues, because as we all know, the HVAC system is a key component of indoor air quality and minimizing the opportunity for mold growth. Promptly notifying property management in writing of any issues related to water or suspect mold growth. And then it also provides some preventive maintenance procedures, preventive procedures for that resident to minimize the opportunity for growth in their unit. So this is a really important document and one that is highly recommended for use to minimize that liability. So with that, I'm right about on time to allow for 15 minutes of Q&A. And if we want to open it up for Q&A, now is the time.
Thank you, Sherry. So what we've had coming through on the Q&A thus far, I want to go ahead and acknowledge it. We have several attendees who have asked about the guide that you have spoken of, the Mold Action Toolkit. So I have replied to each that I could and let them know that you can find that on the naahq.org website. If you go to our resource library, that's where you'll find best practices and industry white papers that we have produced. When you scroll down, it's a little bit past halfway down the page and you'll see it. It will say Managing Mold Action Toolkit, and then you'll click on that to download. It does require you to have your NAA credentials, so you would need to know your username and password to access that and download it. Should you have any questions or unable to access that for your membership, we do encourage you to reach out to our CSC team, our Customer Service Solutions team, and they are able to help you. Now let's take a look and see what other questions may have come in that are separate from the guide. Lee Williams asked, it appears most of our mold cases are caused by the resident's failure to run the AC and or properly run the AC. Absent finding a moisture leak or intrusion, if mold is found on furniture, clothing, etc., is this a clear indication the mold is related to environmental conditions caused by improperly running the air conditioner?
Yes, great question. So we did briefly discuss that when we were talking about the review of the lease addendum. So the answer is that as many recognize the role of the HVAC system, especially in the summer months when we're running our air conditioning. The air conditioning not only cools our air, but it does so by helping to remove the relative humidity from our air. So if we have a system that is not running properly, that is not being turned on, and we are causing high levels of high relative humidity, that clearly is a problem. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, we should have our indoor relative humidity at 30 to 50% and no more than 60%. So in that circumstance where you have high relative humidity above 60%, that will create high relative humidity in the indoor environment and can create mold growth on furnishings, on different types of porous building materials. So it is directly related, it can be directly related to the improper use or improper maintenance of an HVAC system, and that can create higher relative humidity, which can create indoor mold growth.
Thank you. We have a few more questions coming in, so we'll take as many as we can in the time allowed. Tony wanted to know, what was the fourth item mentioned in the litigation section? He believes it was the duty breach causation, and what else?
Yes, so it's duty, breach, causation, and injury or damages. So the fourth prong is injury or damages. So we would need to prove that your breach of duty caused an injury or caused a damage.
An anonymous attendee would like to know, what is the best detergent solution?
Yes, so when I wrote the white paper for the National Apartment Association and we interviewed EPA back in the early 2000s, it really hasn't changed. According to the EPA, when all they recommend is a high quality detergent solution, what does that mean? Literally dishwashing detergent, simple green without a biocide. It's really not about the killing of the mold. It's about the physical removal of the mold, and that's really the key. So where bleach may kill the mold, it doesn't physically remove the mold, and dead mold spores may still be allergenic in the indoor environment. So using a high quality detergent, and it's about the physical removal, abrasion to remove the mold spores, whether they're living or dead, is what the key focus should be.
Great. Jason would like to know, anytime there's a small amount of organic growth, usually on the bathroom ceiling from showering with the door closed, residents may begin to experience symptoms and want compensation on that. How would you handle?
You know, that's an ongoing issue is resident behavior and the liability related to that. You know, I think what it comes down to and what it goes back to is the mold lease addendum and understanding that if you all are using that mold lease addendum, that the resident has a responsibility to maintain their unit. And it specifically references in the mold lease addendum wiping down showers, bathtubs, toilets, sinks, because we all know that when we shower, we create that high relative humidity. And if there's no exhaust fan, if we're not running the exhaust fan, that can create mold following a shower. So what do we do to minimize that? One is we ensure that they're running their exhaust fans. If there is in fact an exhaust fan in the bathroom, they should be running that exhaust fan for 15 to 20 minutes after showering. A good sort of way to know that you ran it long enough is when there's the mirror is not fogged anymore. You know the relative humidity is back to reasonable levels. If there's no exhaust fan in the bathroom, second best case scenario is to slightly open a window. And I recognize that perhaps opening a window in January is not ideal, especially in this part of the country, but there's a basic understanding of science and water. Water moves from high to low. Water seeks equilibrium. So we've all seen that phenomenon where you have high relative humidity, you open up a window and you see the humidity rushing out the window. So you do want to crack the window as a second best case scenario. If there's a circumstance where there's no exhaust fan and there's no window in a bathroom, best case scenario then is to at minimum open the door. So then, like you said, they close the door, so making sure they open the door. So it goes back to resident education. The Brief Guide to Mold, Moisture in Your Home EPA pamphlet that I referenced is tab 4, is a good resource for your residents. Hand that out. Look at the addendum, make sure they understand what their responsibilities are within the addendum, and educate your residents.
How should we go about relaying to residents that the use of pressure cookers and improper use of exhaust fans in the bathroom, along with the running of heat in the summertime, which causes increased moisture in the apartment?
Yep, I think all these questions are sort of similar in that sense. You know, again, it's about resident education. It's about having them understand. That's why the Mold Action Kit has so many different tabs related to educating our residents. The Brief Guide to Mold, Moisture in Your Home, tab 5, which is the California pamphlet, also is about resident education. The addendum has resident education. So I recognize the challenge. This has been my industry for the past 20 years as well. And really it's doing our best to educate them and provide as much information as possible.
What type of tools would you recommend to test for mold?
Okay, good question. So as an industrial hygienist who, you know, does mold, I do mold inspections and assessments, I have never really been a big proponent of sampling for mold. And if I can just talk about that for a minute. Sampling for mold is not a very reliable sampling methodology. So unlike lead or asbestos, we test for lead, it's lead or not. We test for asbestos, it's asbestos or not. It's not like that for mold. As we said, mold is everywhere. Mold makes up 25% of the Earth's biomass. Mold will be in every person's apartment if we took air samples. But what's important to recognize is that the focus is not on the air, it's on the visible growth. So our industry standards, our regulations now in a number of states are all based on visible growth. How much visible growth do we have in our indoor environment? So the overall answer to that question is sampling is limited and our focus should be on visible inspections. And that could be an invasive inspection of behind walls, of within wall cavities, under carpeting. We're talking about an invasive inspection, but the key really is to find the visible growth, not to focus on sampling. If you are going to sample, there are very limited circumstances where you would want to do pre-remediation sampling. It's solely based on visual. We identify it, we find it, we remediate it. Sampling at the end of a remediation to verify that it has actually been remediated is more commonly when we do conduct sampling. And typically what we do as industrial hygienists, as mold assessors, is we take our indoor air samples, we take outdoor air samples, and we compare the two. And basically our outdoor air samples is our baseline. So we look at the type of mold, we look at the quantity of mold indoor and out, and we should find less mold in the indoor environment than we do, less than or equal to than we do outside. So that's pretty much how we identify mold. Those mold action kits that you can purchase from Home Depot for $9.99 that a resident may bring into your office are completely unreliable and just create unnecessary hysteria. What those mold action kits basically say is you take the kit, you put it into your residence, and you wait 7 to 10 days, and then you come back and if mold grows. Well, I'm here to tell you that mold is going to grow on that Petri dish 100% of the time because mold is everywhere. So there is no value whatsoever in those mold test kits, and they're unreliable, and they are just create hysteria for no valid reason.
Following up on sampling, does a resident have the right to demand one?
That's a really hard question to answer. The resident does not have a right to demand air sampling per se, because air sampling pre-remediation is really not part of our industry standard of care. So I think, again, it goes back to educating the residents and explaining to them why sampling is not valuable. One key to providing this information to a resident who's demanding that is to pull out industry resources to validate what you're saying. So not saying, hey, I don't think you need to sample, but saying, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, sampling is not recommended, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and providing their recommendations for sampling. But pre-remediation sampling is not within our industry standard of care. It's not valuable, and it's about educating the residents and explaining to them. Now, as far as ensuring you're doing a proper, thorough visual inspection and making sure you're protecting your industry standard of care as the property management professional, you want to ensure that you're hiring the right person, that you're doing a thorough investigation. And when we're talking about looking for visible mold growth, it's not a 10-minute walkthrough with your maintenance supervisor with a flashlight in his or her hand and saying you got no mold in your apartment. We're talking about a detailed inspection, probably could take 45 minutes to an hour in that unit, looking for visible growth in the HVAC system, behind the walls, underneath carpeting. It can be a very invasive inspection, but the key is always going to be on finding the visible growth.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. We have just a few minutes left. Let's see. We have so many coming in, Sherry. I'm going to be honest. So far, we've gotten about 35 questions. So as you can tell,
Wow.
we will run out of time. But that's good. That means people are engaged, and this is a great topic that they want more information on.
Yeah, and maybe we can find time I can answer the questions, in a written format after the presentation. I'd be happy to do that.
That would be fantastic. I think our members would greatly appreciate that. So we'll go with the last one we just got. Are all types of visible mold the same level of hazard?
Oh, great question. So that is a question I get on a regular basis. Is it the good mold or is it the bad mold? And I'm sure we all get that from our residents. The set answer to that question is, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, all molds are potentially unhealthy in the indoor environment and need to be removed. So there is no such thing as a good mold and a bad mold. All molds are potentially unhealthy. As we talked about, they can cause respiratory issues. They can cause exacerbation of asthma in folks that are already sensitive to it. But there is no such thing as a good mold and a bad mold. All molds are the same, treated the same.
Well, great. Well, Sherry, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. You have provided a tremendous wealth of knowledge to our membership here, and we really thank you and appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to be a resource going forward.
If you refer to the slides, you'll be able to see Sherry's contact information there. In addition, she has graciously offered to assist us with getting through some of the questions we were not able to answer live today. So if you submitted a question and we weren't able to get to it, I'm so sorry, but please know we will work on that behind the scenes and get that out to you shortly. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and we will be placing it on our website on the Industry Operations Solutions page. So please look for that in the next 24 to 48 hours to be posted. Thank you again for joining us today. We value your membership and appreciate your attendance. Have a great day.